Alright, friends, welcome to Comics Odyssey. Once again, thanks for joining me on this journey through the medium of comics. A few housekeeping things. First, I had announced that this was going to come out in live streams on Saturdays, and then the replay would publish on Wednesdays. I did do a live stream Saturday, but it crapped out part of the way, and so we can't have that, and I don't have the time to be re-recording everything twice a week, so we're abandoning the live stream idea, and I'm just going to do these as pre-recorded videos. So I like the idea of live interaction with people, but if it's not a stable thing, the whole live streaming option on Substack, we'll just have to do it the old-fashioned way, so you can follow along and post comments and questions below. All of these are going to be free, so you'll be able to post comments in the post on Substack or in the chat or whatever you like. Another thing is, I want to clarify, this is not a course. I am not qualified to be teaching anybody about the medium of comics or anything like that. I'm just a guy who is really interested in comics, and when I read this in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was quite blown away by it. And so I just want to share people about this amazing book about the medium of comics. It really elevates the medium. And so we'll be discussing it chapter by chapter, starting with chapter 1. This was published in 1993 by Scott McCloud, and it is not the first of its kind, but it is the first that explores the medium of comics with this much depth and breadth. So we'll be looking at its precedents before that came before this, and why this one's is special. So the 9 chapters are Setting the Record Straight, which is a chapter about definition, vocabulary of comics, so basically all the visual elements that fit into comics. Blood in the Gutter is about panel transitions. Time frames is about how time works in comics. Living in Line is about quality of line and what it says about how it influences the reading experience. Show and Tell, I do not remember. The 6 Steps is about the creative process. Word About Color, self-explanatory, and putting it all together. I have my notes here that I read while I read it, and I did notice when you make notes on comics, it takes a little bit longer because you can't just put the page, you have to put the panel as well, so I'm counting panels. So we start with a conversation. So this is Scott McCloud here. He's inserting himself into the story, and he varies between kind of like TED Talk kind of approach, and then a lot of playful. He plays with that format, but it is a non-fiction book, and it's Scott McCloud demonstrating how the comics medium works using the comics medium, which is obviously the best way to go about it. So you can read books about the comics medium, but prose is not the best medium it's not the same medium. So it just makes sense that he would do it this way. So he has a conversation with his friend about what's his next project, and he's distinguishing it from a history of comics, but rather it's an examination of the art form of comics, defining the basic elements, the mind-media relationship, and he discusses the various things he's going to explore in the book. Excuse me. And his friend says, aren't you kind of young to be doing that sort of thing? And he doesn't really have a response for it. So he is both, in this book, you'll see him both issues a challenge to other people, but also is somewhat self-deprecating, which is a good balance to strike between confidence and humility. So he describes here in this first page how when he was a kid he knew exactly what comics were, and that they were kind of the lower art form from real books, which is what he read. But then he hit 8th grade and he discovered the X-Men and he was hooked, and he became obsessed with becoming a comics artist. Here he describes kind of the whole kind of motivating factor of making this book. He felt there was something lurking in comics, something that had never been done, some kind of hidden power. But you may have experienced this. When he was trying to explain this to people, he would get laughed off, right? So this is something I wonder, up until the early 2000s, I feel the comics medium was kind of seen as a lowbrow, juvenile, disposable art form, which is, it sort of is, but there was lots of examples of it not being that. But in the cultural consciousness in North America, very different in Europe and Japan, it was always not if you read comics, it was, I remember my teachers, we would read Tintin and Lucky Luke and that sort of thing. And I distinctly remember this one conversation between two teachers while they were seeing us read comics. And the conversation was something like, well, at least they're reading, right? They may be reading this inferior, crude literature, but at least they're reading. And I think they weren't really paying attention because we were engaged. Maybe I would read regular books, but ones that I thought were exciting and interesting. So, I wonder how much of it was an insecurity or jealousy of us being more engaged with comic books than their boring ass classes. So he's proposing that the reason people fail to understand the potential of comics is that because we define it too narrowly, and we'll see this temperament come up a lot. Scott is very much oriented towards the realm of possibilities. So this first chapter is about defining comics, which is possibly kind of boring for a lot of people because there's assumptions that we already know what comics are, but it's actually important to define the parameters of what you're discussing, especially when you're doing something so ambitious as as exploring an entire medium. You could be too broad and too narrow. And he goes into the challenges of defining this. So let's look at this in detail. He discusses Will Eisner's sequential art, which is Will Eisner's a very important cartoonist, comics artist, and he has done a work similar to this, and he called it sequential art, I believe. And I have read it. I feel like I've read it. And he discusses how this is a definition that is quite utilitarian. It's pragmatic. It works for just about anything, for most purposes. because it's neutral. It doesn't discuss the style of a comic. It's like comics aren't, 4-color, biff bam pow. It's sequential art is basically just pictures in sequence. So it kind of removes all of this value judgment out of it so that you can study it more objectively. And he gives examples here. A static image, just a guy in a top hat. When you put an image next to it, time passes, right? So there's a story. The top hat's coming off. We have a sun. Put two images next to each other, you get a sunset, and so on and so forth. So basically, he's a proponent of separating the content from the container, right? So comics is a medium similar to all these other classic mediums, such as the written word, music, video, theater, visual art, and film. But what you do with the medium, what you deliver with the medium, is not part of the definition of the medium, right? He's saying that though that the sequential art definition is good enough for common parlance, he's trying to be more technical and specific about it. So, for instance, sequential art art is a very broad term. So he's defining sequential visual art. And this is like kind of the TED Talk type of setting here. And in the audience, Bugs Bunny pipes up and says, well, what about animation? Isn't it, art and visual sequence? And he does suggest that that's actually true. If you look at a strip of film, it's a lot of images in sequence. If you were to take out a strip of film, you could read it as just a very, very, very decompressed, slow comic, right? But the thing with animation film is that it's projected onto a single surface. So each image the sequence doesn't go across space. It goes across time. It's in a single space across time. So he's suggesting that to define the comics medium, the sequence must be a sequence of juxtaposed pictorials, right? So one after the other, like this one and that one and this one and that one, as opposed to projected onto a single space. Now, he's suggesting that this should be in deliberate sequence, because you can't just throw images together and call it a comic. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's his suggestion, which is fair enough. And he's always got these little gags in here where someone pipes up in the audience, well, what about Batman? Shouldn't the definition have something about Batman in it? And he's like, no, for real. And what about the X-Men? And, that guy gets thrown out. So he suggests his definition and admits that this sort of thing doesn't come up in casual conversation. And in most cases, the only definition we'll need is sequential art. But with a specific definition, you can then cast that lens on the medium of comics and discover that more things are comics than you might initially expect. For instance, going back hundreds of years, in 1519, a sheepfold, I think it's called, manuscript discovered by Cortez is images in sequence, and he reproduces it here. It even has rudimentary panel borders, and the way it's read is, I think, in a zigzag in a zigzag pattern, but it doesn't matter the direction it's read. It is, what does he say? Juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. So now we can include this in the history of comics and inform ourselves about the medium by having a broader and simultaneously a more specific definition. Here's another one, 1066 by a tapestry. Now he discusses hieroglyphics, and there's a bit of a gray area there because a lot of the hieroglyphics are images in sequence, but they don't represent things. They represent sounds, so they're more like words. And there's a discussion about how how if you squint, you can see words as comics because they're images in sequence, and that's why he adds the definer pictorial. Whereas a letter, the letter R is an image after the letter O, which makes or, but it's not a comic because the O and the R aren't pictorials, right? They don't depict, they represent sounds. That's the distinction between words and comics. Super interesting stuff. But then he's like, some other paintings, Egyptian paintings, do constitute comics because they depict certain things and they're juxtaposed, and so they end up being comics. And he gives an example here. It's very much worth reading, and maybe you're following along in your book, hopefully. And then discusses the importance of the advent of printing, which in our current cultural consciousness, this becomes the kind of a hermeneutical, to use a technical term, definition of comics. This is something I learned a while ago, the difference between types of definitions. I don't know where I came across this, but there's like ontological definition and hermeneutical definition. When you start to see people have fights online, a lot of the time you'll notice it's because they're departing from different defining positions, like ontological, which is kind of what Scott McCloud is doing here, is concerns itself with the fundamental nature of things. So how do you define a thing at its most fundamental? Whereas hermeneutical is defining things as they've come to be, right? So that's why you have like, well, the Bayeux Tapestry is not a comic, because to me a comic's on a printed page, in a rectangle. Well, that's like it's how we currently define things due to the evolution of the medium, right? So there's a distinction. He doesn't discuss this here, but there's a distinction to be made between those two types of definition: the fundamental definition versus the the evolved definition, maybe one way to put it. So here's talking about how like the printed page, it's really changed how like we interact with the medium. Here we have the classic panel to panel on a rectangular sheet. This is the Tortures of Saint Erasmus, a religious depiction of a saint's life. And then father of modern comics is Rodolphe Topher. I don't know much about him, but he's the one that really started to combine words and pictures, which is another kind of hermeneutical or evolved definition that people use. Words and pictures together makes a comic, but there's a reason why that's insufficient as a definition. We'll see it, I think, in a page or two. So it's Rodolphe Topher, whose drawings were a little crude and his writing were a little crude, so he never really was appreciated. in his lifetime, he had a lot of critics that kind of looked down on him, which is something we see a lot, people being dismissive. And you'll learn as you follow along with my Substack. If you're subscribed over time, you'll see that dismissiveness is one of the things that I'm most... I disdain dismissiveness. I think it's quite... It's an obstacle to learning. So, yeah. So basically, kind of like the father of modern comics, it was a editorial cartoonist in a way. So he gives more examples throughout history that we might cast a new lens on and see that they might be considered comics, woodcut novels, and that sort of thing. One example that I remember blew my mind was like the diagram in an airplane that explains what to do in an emergency, or even like when you buy a piece of IKEA furniture, it comes with a comic, an instructional comic. A lot of stained glass art in churches depict, maybe the Stations of the Cross. Like at the church I go to, there's a bunch of paintings all around, 12 paintings, and depicting the Stations of the Cross, which is the journey of Christ towards his crucifixion. And so you could walk the church you could circle the church and read the comic, right? So it's I don't know, to me it's very interesting. Here's why words and pictures is an insufficient definition, because if you remember the Family Circus cartoons in the Sunday papers, if you're old enough to remember the funnies, Sunday funnies, here we have a single image with words under it, but there's no juxtaposition there's no sequence, so it's not a comic. So he says it kind of get lumped into the definition because the style in which they're drawn is reminiscent of comic art, but again, separating the medium separating the content from the medium, we can't legitimately define that as a comic, at least not for the purposes of this exploration of the medium in this book. So once again, looking at the possibilities now. Again, many possible worlds. He's constantly pointing towards the possibilities. At one point here, he lays down the gauntlet in a way, and he says, if anyone wants to write a book taking the opposite view, you can bet I'll be the first in line to buy a copy. So it's a very polite and diplomatic way of saying, if you can do better, go ahead. And I think the challenge stands. I don't think that there's a consensus better thesis on the medium of comics since 1993 that's been published. Not that I know. So respect where it's due, right? He did the work and reaped the rewards. So that's the chapter. Let me look through my notes here. This is the second time I've gone through this, so I remembered a lot of stuff. There was a little something I wanted to point out, little detail. I thought that was interesting here. He does these ornamentations at the top of the chapter. And if you look closely, each of these has a head, a little head drawn. So this is the Thing from Fantastic Four, representing the Western realm of comics, North American realm of comics. And so you got the superheroes, so that Jack Kirby, Tintin for representing the European realm of comics, Astro Boy representing the Japanese Asian realm of comics, and you have a little mouse here, which is Art Spiegelman's classic mouse comic. So that's representing kind of the underground world of comics, right? I thought that was a really interesting touch. So let me throw a question to you about the connotations, cultural connotations of comics. Do you think they're still seen as a lowbrow kind of crude, juvenile art form, or has that been changing? And why do you think they developed this reputation? I think the Senate hearings on juvenile delinquency in the 50s, which led to a mass hostility towards comics, even comic burnings, and the subsequent formation of the Comics Code Authority. So I'm going to link below to some essays about this, one that I wrote, plus some that were written by Man of the Atom here on Substack, which are really quite in-depth and detailed looks at the Comics Code Authority. Why do you think comics ever got a negative reputation? And has that changed, or do you notice that it's still around? So looking forward to reading your comics. If you have questions about any of this, suggestions, go ahead and let me know. Next week we'll be looking at the vocabulary of comics. This was a chapter that I remember really blew my mind. So looking forward to exploring this with you. Thanks for listening. See you next time. God bless.